Good afternoon. I'm Michael Ignatieff. I'm the rector and president of Central European University, and I wanted to welcome everybody here, students, faculty, and members of the general public. I wanted to welcome particularly warmly our friend, the ambassador from Thailand, who's been here many times and has, with whom I've had some very good discussions. And I want to welcome Dr. Panitchpakdi. Did I say that passably okay? Was that okay?
No accent, just like a Thai.
Well, I intend no disrespect. My name is Ignatieff. It's not easy, so I'm extremely sensitive to any mispronunciation of national names. Dr. Panitchpakdi is an extremely distinguished public servant. You will know that he was the Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. You'll know he was the Director General of the WTO. Prior to that, he had important roles in the public service of Thailand as Deputy Minister of Finance. He has a PhD in economics, studied with Jan Tinbergen, a Nobel laureate. He's published books on globalization and trade. And there might have been a time when trade was a kind of boring, marginal subject for experts. That time has passed. I will say no more about that, but it is clear suddenly that global trade is absolutely at the forefront of global politics, among the most controversial and difficult subjects we have to face. A personal note, a Canadian like me who was once in the public sector in Canada, we took the trade arrangements upon which our prosperity was built entirely for granted. Simply never thought about NAFTA, the trade arrangement that we have between Canada, the United States, and Mexico that allows us to ship goods across borders without even thinking about it, so that vehicles we call Canadian have a bit of steel that started in Quebec and have a dashboard that was made in Indiana and has some tires that came from Canada, and that's what we thought a vehicle was. A Canadian-made vehicle was a vehicle made in all these places. And suddenly we're in a new world in which all of those assumptions about the structure of international trade are now in question. I don't mention this to embarrass our guest who may or may not talk about that, but I certainly will be listening to anybody who has his experience in international trade. And so I hope that we will all welcome Dr. Panitchpakdi and listen attentively to his remarks. Thank you so much.
Rector and President Orvat of the Central European University, Your Excellency, the Ambassador Chakrit from the Royal Thai Embassy, dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I have not actually been doing this kind of lecture for a period of time since I left Geneva in 2014. It's been quite a while. But I did do some brief remarks and keynote speeches, but this one would take me into a longer elaboration of what I have thought, what I'm thinking about the global evolution, globalization that we are witnessing today. This is really a strange time. This is a strange world at the moment because it's not. Sometimes economists would call the present situation in the global economy as new normal. they call it new normal. Actually, new normal for my colleagues economists probably should indicate the kind of new situation which is normal to the economists. I guess it's something about the kind of a new period of predominant role of the deflationary impact that has been created since the last so-called Great Recession, 2008, 2009. Because as you can see, we economists have been used to fight against more of the inflationary impact, the way that we need to control money supply, the way that we need to be trying to discipline our colleagues in the fiscal areas, and fiscal policies would have to be made in a way that we would not allow deficits to outgrow the capacity for the governments to incur debt and repay the debts in a way that it could be useful for the economy. We're not seeing that at the moment. But I cannot disagree more with the word new normal, because it's nothing new what we're seeing at the moment. It's a kind of reaction to the crisis in 2008, 2009, which people try to compare with the largest one before that was actually created in the 1920s, in 1929, 1930s, with the dire consequences that people thought that the ways that we would have to get out of that kind of a depression era was to be more restrictive with trade. Because in those days, I think people actually knew what they were doing, but they were still very primitive in the way they think about the kind of monetary and trade policy, as Victor has already alluded to. They thought if you have actually suffer from outflow of funds and trade deficit, current account deficit, best way to stop the bleeding is to stop trade, to block trade, block particularly import. And that has led to some of the most devastating era of the trade scenario since we've seen the international trade being brought to this world. It has given us a real good lesson, a historic lesson, that you cannot actually intervene by using administrative measures to try to redress the macroeconomic issues that need to be remedied by coherent kind of real and monetary policies together. It's not only, you see the end results in terms of trade, but trade actually is the final end products of what macroeconomic policies have been doing in your own country. I'm saying this, that the world is turning a bit upside down, and the new normal is not really new because we've seen something like this happening in the past, but people tend not to learn from past history. My colleagues used to say that the lesson that we learn from past history is that we never learn. We have been here, we have been there before, but it seems that every time we are confronted with a different situation, we always think that, oh, well, this is something that may need something else. We don't have a recollection of the historic events that should have taught us what to do and what not to do. And this is particularly so with economics, because economics doesn't have a laboratory wherein you can go in and experiment your policy-making exercise. You can only learn from past analysis of past historical events to be able to understand what kind of remedies, what kind of policies that have been useful, what kind of policies that could not be excessively utilized because it can create side effects. But at the moment, we are living in a world wherein, instead of transforming ourselves from the past period of globalization, I used to call it the second globalization period. This is going to be the third one. I would have thought that the third period of globalization would have ringed in more participation from all over the world. The first globalization, as we saw before the First World War, was actually Europe-centric. It was mainly around this area. Second generation covered the whole world more so, but it also covered mainly the rise of the large multinational corporations. The third one, which should be the one in which poorer economies, developing countries, should partake more into the process. As we see the rise of what they call the rise of the global south, where in developing countries, emerging markets are trading more among themselves, more with the rest of the world, to cover more than half of the global trade. So that should bring in actually a more balanced, a more inclusive kind of globalization and international trade evolution that should be something which is an improved version of the second generation of globalization. But it's not to be so. 2 years ago, not 2 years ago, it was last year. It was last year, beginning of 2017, January, in Davos. I don't know whether you had this recollection of the Davos meeting of last year. You must have found something to remember. There was really a memorable Davos meeting last year in 2017. Memorable for two things. One thing was that normally at Davos meeting, you see a lot of leaders from around the world coming. Any part of the world, leading personalities. But one leader of the world, leader of China, normally they won't appear at the Davos meeting. There has been no president from China that has appeared at the Davos meeting. Premier, yes. Prime Minister, yes. But last year, President Xi Jinping himself made a point that he should attend, and then he went. He went to Davos. And actually, this is the starting point that I would like, if you have time, just take a look at the speech that Xi Jinping delivered in Davos. I will come back to that. But the second part that is a surprise for Davos is that there was no real leadership from the side of the United States. Normally, leaders, leading congressmen, politicians from the United States would be there, but last year, there were not very much a significant representation from the United States side. Well, mainly because President Trump was just elected, and so he could be excused for not coming. But there was a lack of participation from the US side. But the thing that is most memorable at that meeting, and if you have time, I would recommend you to take a look into the address that was delivered by President Xi Jinping at that meeting. And the thing that actually drew my attention to that speech was when he first started a few sentences, he was quoting, of all people, Charles Dickens. Do you know Charles Dickens? Charles Dickens is a typical Western Anglo-Saxon author who wrote about poor people, rich people, And there was, I think, one book or one piece of literature that Charles Dickens wrote after the first Industrial Revolution. Must be in the 19th century, 18 something. And there was one sentence that he wrote in that time, in the wake of the first Industrial Revolution. He said, "It was the best of time, and it was the worst of time." This is the sentence that Xi Jinping started off his address by quoting Charles Dickens, saying that for him, this is the best of time, and it was also the worst of time. And he went on to say positive things about globalization, that it has brought us into a more modern age, help China to reduce poverty, help make people live longer, become healthier and everything, has brought us digital economy, the digital age, brought us the kind of communication possibility, potential around the world that we have never seen before. So actually, globalization has brought us benefits that we have traded with each other as never before. The rise of trade volume every year before the crisis in 2008 was on average 6-7% per year, which is quite great because output growth was around 3 to 4%. So always the trade share of GDP, of global GDP, has been expanding all the time. So become more and more globalized all the time. We trade, we travel. But at the same time, it was the worst of time. And during the time that we had globalization, we also had horrid time with economic crisis. You may not realize it because the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they have counted the number of crises between, they said, the 40 years between 1970 and 2011. They have counted 147 banking crises around the world. Can you imagine? Nearly 150 crises around the world in the 40 years period. So, the situation of a new normal or the critical period at the moment, we've seen it before, we've been there before, and we should have learned from the past experiences, which we sometimes learn, we sometimes do not. But we've seen crises before, big and small, but we've been here before. And there are more negative things like the rise of terrorism, the problem with migration, refugees, incidents of poverty, unemployment, and one of the worst things that has happened during the period of rapid global growth was the widening gap of income inequality. So it was a best of time, and at the same time, it was also the worst of time. And that was what Xi Jinping was saying in Davos. And he was saying that in spite of all these happenings, the bad and good things about globalization, we in China, he said, we managed to benefit from the process of globalization. The net result for China was a positive net result. He said it was a very difficult decision for China to become the member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. I used to negotiate with them when they acceded into the WTO. It took them more than 7 to 10 years before they could exceed the WTO. Can you imagine? It took them more than 7 years. Some of their leaders in those days told me it's just like fighting a big war that they have seen during the war period. It was just like fighting a big war. It was touch and go. It was a period in which senior Chinese leaders were thinking that maybe we were not doing the right thing. But ultimately, Xi Jinping said in his speech, we decide to go in. We decide, what he said was to jump into the ocean or to the water, something like that, he said. And we come out, we didn't drown. And we survived and survived well. China survived so well within the context of the World Trade Organization that sometimes some of the more advanced economies are thinking that China maybe have been abusing or profiting from being part of the World Trade Organization too much. This is, you may not realize it here, but when we in Asia look at the news and comments on Chinese economies and look at the CNN, I was in China quite often. One day I woke up, I saw the news, CNN, there's a bubble in China. I was shocked because I never read it before. Where is a bubble? I was in China, I was in Beijing. And then the bubble was supposed to, that was the bubble in one of the provinces of China. That may be large province, equivalent to one country somewhere else, but it was some bubble in the real estate sector that occur from time to time because the real estate growth in China was sometimes a bit excessive. So there was some bubble somewhere in China. But overall, it was not really the collapse of the Chinese economy. But it created a lot of uneasiness and the concerns of investors around the world. So that was the time beginning of last year. Why in the US, the new president was saying that, well, trade war for me is nothing. I can win trade war anytime, hands down. Problem in Asia, problem in the world created by China, our trade with China. We are in deficit. That's why we're not growing, and the deficit can only be cut down when the Chinese cut down their export to United States, and so there'll be less trade, less import from China into United States. Then out of the, I don't know how much, nearly 400 or 500 billions of trade deficit in China, out of which China would account for 300 and 350 billion. If we just throw that out of the window, then we will be safe and free. So this is a world turning upside down. Oh, President Trump said even more than that. He went on to castigate my former employer, World Trade Organization, by saying that the WTO is a catastrophe. The WTO is a catastrophe. So you see, this is a world that we've been witnessing from both sides. When I was in Geneva, it was already, the mood was in the world was rather grim because the length of recovery process of this last recession from 2008 to 2018 has been quite a long period. At the same time, the revival of the global economy started mainly in the part of the world which is emerging economy. Emerging economy and those in Asia actually emerged from the crisis as early as 2009, whereas United States, it took them, I don't know, until the last couple of years, when US put in unprecedented amount of liquidity into the market. Well, people have lost count, but I have read several reports, and my own counting is that at least $5 trillion US dollars of liquidity, the so-called quantitative easing, has been put into the banking account so that it can pump up the economy in the United States, which didn't help very much. In Europe, we started to do the same thing with the quantitative easing much later than the United States, but it was much less resolute than the United States, so the recovery process was a bit intermittent, not really even, uneven. Japan did the same thing with quantitative easing, so the whole world actually flooded economy with liquidity, with money, with the hope that there would be a quick recovery of the global economy. That's why they say this is new normal. No matter how much we pump in the money, the economy would not recover. Not until, I would say, the last few years, and still, this is what I am still thinking about the global economic outlook, is that we cannot rest assured that this is really a real recovery. Because Professor Larry Summers sometimes has been saying this is just a statistical recovery, and I tend to believe with him. Not always that I believe, I would agree with what Larry would be saying, but he was saying about this recovery that this is statistical recovery. As part of the spillover effects coming from the stimulus measures to take the world out of deflation, of the greatest ever deflation that we've seen in the modern day, was that the liquidity that has been pumped into the market, that they have not actually been disbursed by the banks into the real investment that would help to create more research, increase productivity, increase real production, and therefore also lead to more trade around the world. It was not so. For many years after 2008, and I know this because at my former institution, the UNCTAD, we produce an annual investment report. Year after year, investment has been contracting around the world, the so-called foreign direct investment. Contracting, until the last couple of years when investment around the world began to expand. If you look into the reports of the big multinational firms, you would see that these are the firms that are actually maintaining huge liquidity balances on their accounts, that they have not been investing them. And the question is why, in spite of all the... So, you see, the issue that I'm taking up here is that you cannot always cure the illness with a means that has actually led to that illness. Because the means or the cause of that illness was so much borrowing, so much money so much money to create a lot of bubbles in the asset prices, in the stock prices, in the prices of land, in the prices of houses, of condominium, that have led people into believing that this is going to be a heaven forever. This will be something that we can live on, we can borrow more because our assets, our houses, our shares have been always increasing in value. And that was actually part of the illusion that has led to the kind of what Professor Harold Minsky, the Minsky moment, and that broke out in 2007, 2008 when Lehman Brothers had to be liquidated and AIG has to be rescued. So it's a world turning upside down, that the paragon of capitalist market economy has been resorting to state intervention in ways that we have never seen before, in ways that those countries used to renounce, that state intervention or policy space should not be allowed for countries, that we should leave all things to the market, that the efficient market hypothesis is a deus ex machina, is something that is always right, which has been proven wrong. And this is what we at UNCTAD has always been trying to warn the world that has become a little bit uneven because you see imbalances around the world in trade, in budgeting, in borrowings. It cannot be maintained like that. And now we are seeing again that, we are out of the woods at the moment. Everything is doing well, the world is sunny, and we're seeing growth in the United States after so many years of anemic growth. We're seeing growth in Europe after so many years of ups and downs. One recession, double recession, triple recessions. And we can stop now flooding the world with liquidity, which is bad because you flood the world with liquidity that will not go into the real sector. It will go somewhere. So it was put into the asset market, and you see prices of shares around the world going up with no reasons. In various economies around the world, you don't see companies making profits that should warrant the kind of rise in their own value of their shares. In the United States, since the recession, 2008 up until now, Dow Jones and all these indices has been growing all the time. This is a large purple patch for those who have been investing in the US stocks market, in spite of the fact that the economy has not yet recovered. But it has brought the world into a new situation in which the share of income that has already been unequal has become even more unequal. We have now, at the moment, you know this, I'm just repeating the thing that you know, 1% of the global population that owns the wealth equivalent to half of the global wealth existing today. 1%, just owning half of the world. We have 3.5 billion people, nearly half of humanity, owning a menial 2.7% of the global wealth. And these figures will not get better. These are figures that getting worse. I mean, the 1% of the world population, the richest billionaire in the world, they are going to own more than a half in the next 10 years. This is the prognosis. This is something that I don't have to invent, but this is figures coming out of the UN, coming out of the Oxfam, coming out of the Oxford Economics. All these people are producing same kind of figures. So the richer are growing much faster in their riches than the poor are getting less poor. Figures are everywhere. The middle income people in the United States, median income has not been growing the last 10 years. This is a fact. Unemployment in Europe, sorry to say this has been really a rigidity in Europe that unemployment has been really, double-digit unemployment is really bad. Here or anywhere else in the world, but to have double-digit unemployment in an advanced economy like in Europe, 10% on average, more than 10% for the young people, for the youth. Certain period of time, some economies in Europe have youth unemployment 25%. It's not Greece, and I don't say it's Greece. Greece is the worst of that. So this is the situation with so much money into the economies around the world, so much QEs, QE1, QE2, QE3s, and still pumping. Europe probably will be stopping this year, but still pumping. United States has stopped doing the tapering of the QE, the quantitative easing. And now everyone is saying, this is a bright sunny day and it's going to be with us. This is a real recovery. And I'm saying, no, I don't see it that way. And I'm sorry that I would have to be, and again, doing the dismal kind of talking as economists are prone to do, but I thought, well, the good things you can read in the newspaper anyway. And there'll be good things to be produced by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Their task anyway to be saying nice things, and national governments prone to be saying some of the bright things. Very optimistic. They would say, they would say that one swallow would make the summer, which is not so. You see, one swallow, you say, this summer coming. It's not going to be like that. And I'm risking, when I say this, that I'm not seeing a real recovery yet. And I used to be reminded by Lord Keynes, who used to say that it is better to be vaguely right than to be precisely wrong. And I'm risking this because I don't know whether I'm vaguely right or not, because it's very vague. But if you listen to me, you see where I'm coming from. So I would have to be very cautious when I'm talking about this new generation of globalization, the third one that I'm talking about, and the kind of upside down economy that we're seeing on the part that part of the world. Chinese economy, known as the socialist market economy, now completely endorsing market-based, market-oriented globalization, while the western part of the world, which used to be the proponent of market economies, is now turning away and withdrawing themselves from the kind of multilateralism process that they used to endorse. This has been 10 years. This year is a 10. Sorry, can I have some water? Thank you. Okay. This is the 10th anniversary of the global crisis from 2008 to 2018. And this is, from the beginning, a strange crisis. You probably have read or been told about Queen Elizabeth remarked when a few years after the crisis she went to London School of Economics, and she was asking the professor, economic professor at the London School, saying, is it true that none of you has ever predicted this? You know, normally economists would predict 9 out of the past 3 recessions. That's what we used to do, predict 9 of the last 3 recessions. But Queen Elizabeth went to LSE and she said, is it true that, you professors have not really been predicting this? And yes, there have been some who has been predicting it, but on record, it was very strange that the first warning came from where, did you know? Came from Asia. It came from Asia, it came from Japan, from the Central Bank of Japan, from the Bank of Japan. You see, because the Central Bank of Japan and Japan has suffered for decades. The first decade in the 1990s and in the second decade, nearly 2 decades of economic deflation. Because Japan never dealt really with the kind of malaise that was underlying. They never deal with the banks that should be taken out, should collapse. They keep everything alive. A lot of Frankenstein living in the Japanese economy, kept them alive. And they have not going. They just keep waiting for the death sentence and everything. So it was a Bank of Japan staff members who have actually notified us quite a few years before 2007. And they were looking at some of their past experiences. You see, so history does teach us something. They look at the excessive prices of assets. They look at the way the borrowings, the debts of government, the corporate debts have been multiplying. And they look at the situation in the United States, situation in Europe and around the world, and they said, well, this is something which is very precarious. They saw it coming. They have lived with it in Japan. And the bad loans that have been accumulated went up to around $1 trillion in the 1980s in the real estate bubble in Japan. And that never went away, actually, because they kept it on their books. They should have taken it out, cleaned it, everything, take bad loans out, set up a new bank, good asset bank, but they didn't do it. So they spotted coming, and they saw the pre-crisis sentiment of hubris. Couldn't care less, this is going to be all right, we invent this paper, we securitize this, we make derivative here. If the derivative become risky, we create another, what is it called, the credit default swap, so we can guarantee on guarantee. Not enough guarantee for this one, we put another guarantee. So it became a long line of securitization that those people who came in, at the end of the line, they didn't know what actually originated the value of all the things that they are holding on to. And I used to be a banker before, and colleagues in banking business used to tell me, and I could understand that being a decent banker, you don't question, because it looks bad if you don't understand what is it. Why is it called CDO? What is it swap? What is it meant? Who is actually the real borrowers behind all these securitized loans and everything? It doesn't look, very, very respectable. So nobody knows. And so this accumulation of hubris, greed is good. Opacity. I was told that in the US Fed, a lot of former colleagues from the Goldman Sachs, they would go to Goldman Sachs, they would come back into the Fed. And so the people who supervise the banking system and people are being supervised, they're the same people. So you cannot do that. You cannot play the role of the referee and be kicking the ball with you. So you have to be different people. And the models that they're using are the same models. Tunnel vision. They said, oh, wow, shadow finance, what is shadow financing? This is efficient financing. You don't do direct borrowing, but you try to create layers after layers of financing so that it can be exceeded by people easily. And look at, it was all done with good intention. The rise of the so-called subprime mortgage crisis came with a good intention that politicians in the United States wanted to tackle inequality. Did you see that? And books written on that. Because of inequality, people could not actually finance the mortgage of their home, particularly the poor ones. So what they did in the United States was to tell the loan association, the housing banks, and all these people, don't worry about it. There will be people who can do the normal prime mortgage credit. There will be those who we would call subprime, a little bit under prime. But they should be lent to because they need a house. So go and do it. And the housing prices are going up so they can repay the loan. Don't worry about that. And so because of good intention, subprime credits expanded and expand. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they would be our supporting hands. Whatever you lend, you can resell it to us and we will support the market. So there will be no loss of values. So this is the greed, the hubris, the opacity, and the tunnel vision, and the kind of, I would say, the misconceived Fed policies in trying to keep interest rate very low at the time that they should have actually lifted interest rate certain period of time. There was one, I can mention his name, and he said this himself, Ben Bernanke, very famous economic professor, Federal Reserve Chairman. Just before the subprime crisis broke out in 2007, he came out and declared that the problem in the subprime mortgage market was so limited, they would not create, and the words he used was significant spillovers. There would be some problems, some bad loans, but there would be no significant spillovers. And I quote him. This is what Mr. Bernanke was saying. I originally assumed that people would act in a wholly rational way. That turned out to be wrong. I originally assumed that people would act in a wholly rational way. That turned out to be wrong. This is a very instructive comment by a former Federal Reserve Chairman. People are never rational. If you haven't read the book by Mr. Professor Kahneman, Professor Kahneman, who was a Nobel Prize laureate, I think, Kahneman professor. He was a psychologist, but he got his Nobel Prize in economics. Can you imagine? Economists this day do not win economics Nobel Prize, but somebody else. He won Nobel Prize, and he was a one who actually tried to make sense of what economists try to say, this is the rationale of human being. What he said in his book, the book was, this Think Short, Think Long, or something like that, or this is a book by Kahneman, the one you must have seen. It's a famous book anyway. In that book, he was trying to explain to people, to us, that normal human beings are not normal, are not always rational in the way we decide what we do. He quoted one example which I remember, but people don't believe in this. But he said something like, 1/3 of the new startups in the United States would only survive the first 5 years of their life. Only 1/3, 2/3 would go away. But when people do their startup, they would say, I'm not the part of the 2/3, I'm part of the 1/3. I will always survive. People who've done wrong in this area, I go in and do it. I said, no, I would not do the same thing because I'll know better. People always try to side with themselves, bias in favor of oneself when decide to do things and not always act rationally. And this is, again, I found it back in Ben Bernanke's report, statement, I think it was statement to the Senate or something. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just a few months before hell broke out, Lehman Brothers and I don't know different banks, United States, and the AIG, IMF still gave a clean bill of health to the financial system in the United States with our report. You can go and check this. So actually, the belief in the system that one thinks one knows best should not be maintained as a permanent righteousness. The present Canada's foreign minister, Ms. Chrystia Freeland, I like her a lot. She speaks her mind. She's very straightforward. She said this, and I quote from her. She said, authoritarianism is on the rise. Authoritarianism is on the rise. Liberal democracy was under threat. If history tells us one thing, it is that no one nation's preeminence is eternal. No one nation's preeminence is eternal. Another very instructive comment from one of the major negotiators now working through the complicated negotiation to recreate NAFTA 2.0. But I'm making reference to this 10th anniversary of the crisis, lest you might forget, because the lesson to be learned there. The lesson that we are now may be having to relearn is another report coming from the Bank of International Settlements. They have just reported that the ratio of global debt to GDP has jumped from 179% to 217% between 2007 and 2017, the last 10 years, during the crisis period. During the crisis period, 2007, 2017, the debt to GDP share around the world has risen by nearly twice. This is more so than before we went into the crisis in 2007. And this is now global. In those days, it was mainly United States, Japan, some countries in Europe, but now it's global. And the situation is this. After the crisis, it was mainly the advanced world that saw an anemic growth. Some negative in Europe, some very small, plus 0.5, 1, 1.5, up until the last couple of years. And the global growth was only maintained, upheld, because of the rise of the growth rates coming from the emerging markets economy. The likes of the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilian, Mexico maybe a little bit, Indonesian, the Philippines, ASEAN, South Africa. Some of the emerging market economies, they've been growing. But as time went by, and as the contraction of the global trade remains, all these countries actually have suffered also. So ultimately, in the last couple of years, the whole world was suffering, not only the part of the advanced economy that suffered from the recession, so including the emerging economy as well. Now, the problem is that the emerging economy, when they suffer, unlike United States, they can print dollars, all the time, no problem. But emerging economies, when they suffer, they tend to print their own money, which is not accepted by people. They can print, but when they print, actually they reduce the value of the money, so that's not worthwhile anyway. If they cannot print anymore because they run out of paper or they run out of the ideas to print, they would go out and borrow. And as I have told you from the beginning, the world was flooded with liquidity, nowhere to go. All these countries that used not to be able to borrow easily, they borrow easily. I wouldn't name names, but I would name some names later on. They borrow easily, they borrow at rates that are just rock bottom. Not what they're supposed to be borrowing, not what they would deserve to borrow, because that would not give them the right kind of discipline to maintain when they're using excessive borrowing. And now you can see Turkey, Venezuela, Argentina, Indonesia the other day, Greece, that, and a few more. I mean, I'm just mentioning some names that you probably have seen in the paper. These are some of the big issues. And I have to remind you of all this because people never learn from history. They just don't forget, they just don't recognize that there have been historic events like this that happened before. And so we're now coming back to a situation wherein this is another Minsky moment that we are feeling fine. Sunny day, sunny futures, everything is going to be all right. You know, we can have many trade wars and we win all these trade wars. And we can have deglobalization. We can have disintegration of, I don't know, in Europe or somewhere else, and then we'll survive because we are great. But you see, this is why we are lulled into this complacency that has brought us hubris, tunnel vision, opacity in the way we do our policies, that can bring us back into the situation before the crisis. Now, if you read all these financial papers, economic analysis in the last couple of years, you'll be seeing more people trying to come up with a doomsday prediction, saying things are not so good. They're not. I'll come back to some of the issues in Turkey, because Turkey impact will have for Europe a lot. Will have a lot of impact for Europe. Venezuela, Greece, Argentina, and all these things. But before I go to that, let me come back to prophets of the doom. I'm not the only one. I'm not predicting doom anyway, so you can see I'm not predicting the doom. I'm saying we should learn from history. We should never forget what happened before the Lehman collapse. We should not forget the impact of the stimulus measures post-crisis, the impact. And we should not forget what has been happening in the last decade that would actually indicate the sowing of seeds for future crisis. Now, there are three liberal prophets of doom who has written papers, given speech somewhere in the world in the last couple of months. These are all three people you would know very well. The first one is Mr. George Soros, Hungarian-American, billionaire philanthropist. Well, I can't say he's a good friend of mine, but we know each other well, and I know his work in charity and the way he supports students around the world, and trying to do one thing that I used to work with him was in the areas of trying to liberalize the way we do research on medicine and try to propagate the knowledge of medical fields and the way we produce new drugs so that people can help the poor countries to have put their hands on some of the expensive drugs around the world. You know, this is part of the WTO work that we've been doing from long ago to do what we call parallel importing, to try to liberalize the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, so that poor countries can also be trying to sort out their own serious issues of contagious diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, including HIV/AIDS. Mr. Soros has been making few speeches in the last couple of months. And one speech was made at the European Council for Foreign Relations. I think this is a council that Mr. Soros himself has been giving a lot of support. And this is what I'm going to quote to you, because I cannot actually give you the whole analysis of what he said, but this is a key, the gist of his speech. I quote, "The European Union is in an existential crisis. Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. Austerity-prone rich countries have become creditors. Struggling economies becoming debtors. A relationship that is neither voluntary nor equal." So this is his prognosis, quite gloomy for Europe, and Europe that is a bit of a divide between the richer one, the creditors, and the debtors. And as you can see, this is not the situation that changed overnight. It's something, it's becoming more permanent, that is of grave concern. Creditors actually would need to be more generous in trying to help the debtor countries to resolve their own problem. But this is not happening, and it is an unequal situation at the moment that cannot be maintained very long. Of course, I don't want to comment on situation in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, but you know Mr. Soros has been doing this all the time, so he was very concerned with the extreme political ideology that is creeping up in Europe, not only in this part of the world. I mean, you saw the election the other day, yesterday in Sweden. You see the rise of populism in Europe. Don't ever say again that populism this day is just enlightened populism. It's not the same as we saw in the 1930s, you know. This populism is populism. Right wing is right wing. Extreme right wing is very extreme right wing, and they all are actually moving ahead, while globalization, while multilateralism is just being withdrawn and retreating. So it's not only Mr. Soros has been saying things like this. I saw another speech made by President of France, Mr. Macron. He made also another very significant speech, and he actually, he's been always a very optimistic person. But this time at the meeting of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, just a few months ago in April this year, what he said is this, I quote, "A sort of European civil war is reappearing, where our national egoism appear more important than what unite us, where fascination with illiberalism is growing by the day, where geopolitical threats give Europe a responsibility which grows day by day." So again, another prognosis, not really pure doom, but just gloomy, coming from President of France. The third one, this is all happening in the last couple of months. Obama, former President Obama, he was in Johannesburg the other day making a speech in honor of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Mandela's. And he also said something like this: "The promise of a better world is now diminishing. The promise of a better world is now diminishing. We now see much of the world threatening to return to older, more dangerous, a more brutal way of doing business. Poverty, discrimination, violence all remain, sometimes even growing, as does inequality. And he also said somewhere something like this, that, elites are more closed off from the mass of the people. This is why we've been seeing the rise of the Arab Spring and the rise of we are the 1 billion people. All this dissatisfaction, discontent of those who have not been positively affected by globalization process. And these are not really the three critics that I have quoted to you came to my mind because I've been reading this, and then I began to note down, and I saw, and there are more of this. I could have cited you some of the speeches that my former boss, Mr. Kofi Annan, was making before his unfortunate passing. He was making the same speech, that people around the world that he's been meeting, they have come to have less trust and belief in their own politicians and political institutions. So something he was saying, I quote to you Larry Summer, and he was also saying something like that 2016, not last year, but he was talking about 2016. He said 2016 should be remembered as a dawn of the process of deglobalization, something like that. That's what he said. And so many people have been doing this in the last few months and the last few years. So I'm not the only one that has brought this a bit gloomy picture to you, but just to be reminding you that do not ever forget what happened in the past. That's the only laboratory that we have for economics. To give you even some of the bad news, not really bad news, but just a reminder, food for thought. There are so many new books being published in the last couple of years that discuss challenges to globalization. We have always thought that globalization is irreversible. And it may be irreversible because globalization, I always say, is not an endogenous process. Globalization is an exogenous process. You like it or you don't like it, it will be propelled by forces outside of government's control, your control, multinational control, because it will be propelled by advance in technology, science, and research, and communication, and connectivity, and transportation, everything. So globalization will move forward. But globalization seen as an institution, institutional globalization, the way we can produce international agreements, the way we would all observe international agreements, the way we would execute global agreements in the way that we are responsible nations and people. This is a bit more in doubt. 3 books quickly that I will go through for you so that if you have time, you can have a look for yourself. Interesting books. One book was by a gentleman called Stephen King. Stephen King used to be an economist working in the city in London. He wrote a book called Grave New World, not Brave New World. It's a Grave New World. The End of Globalization and the Return of History. This is just a bit of a cash on Francis Fukuyama on the end of history. But this is Grave New World, the end of globalization, the return of history. History has not ended yet. With the end of communism, Francis was saying it's end of history. Stephen King saying no, this is the end of globalization and the return of history. We're going to write another history. Second book, I would take these 2 books together by another friend called Bill Emmett. Bill Emmett used to be former editor of The Economist. Very good economic author, former editor of Economist. Bill Emmett has written a book called The Fate of the West. The Fate of the West. The Battle to Save the World's Most Successful Political Ideas. The Fate of the West the battle to save the world's most successful political ideas. Now, the gist of these two books is this, that instead of calling us, well, sometimes we call it globalization. What we are seeing in terms of practical political implication is openness. Globalization is about openness, right? So when we call openness, it's globalization, because if it's closeness, if close, it's not global, it's not globalized. So these two books actually, they foresee a period of unprecedented threat. This is their words, unprecedented threat to the system of economic and political openness, as resulting from global financial crisis and exacerbated by economic inequality. As a result, you see a rejection of liberal values underpinning globalization and democracy. So you see the three gentlemen that I have actually quoted their remarks to you, and some of these authors who have been working in areas that they should know, because one works in the heart of the capitalist market capitalist economy in the city of London. Another one is in economists, also another paragon of liberal economic ideas. They are actually losing hopes of this grave new world with this unprecedented threat, the existential threat, also to institutions like the World Trade Organization. I'll come back to that later on towards the end. They propose that there should be some new forms of global organization. This one, because they feel that the unregulated global capital flows around the world should be more regulated. Now, this you can see for yourself whether you agree with or not, but you see, the thing that we promised to each other in the wake of the last crisis was to have international financial reforms. International financial reforms. We have not been very successful with that. We have been successful in dealing with the too large to fail thing. That is something that the Bank for International Settlement has set up some rules and regulation to deal with the too big to fail. Because you see, all these national governments are held in ransom by huge financial institutions. When you become so large, you are not allowed to fail. In Switzerland, where all of my UN colleagues bank with UBS, we all have our account with UBS, we bank with UBS. At the time of the crisis, UBS existence was threatened. And the size of UBS, is many times the size of the Swiss economy. So the Swiss government put everything in there to help UBS to survive. And UBS just survives, and survives very well today, but with a huge support rescue operation from the Swiss government. So when financial institutions get to be a bit too large, they cannot be allowed to fail, because the whole country will fail many times over. So this is something that for the future, they must be allowed to fail, to collapse. So with the reforms, at least in this area, we have reached some agreement that if your size is exceeding what they call the spatially large institution, you have to do the following, the new rules. The size of equity must be larger than a normal bank. Liquidity position must be this and that, and so the non-leveraged borrowings must not be larger than certain level of their capital. So many things just to control them, and if they fail, they fail. No, they will not be rescued, and then the depositors will have to take care of themselves. So one book, Stephen King recommend us to have a global organization that would have a kind of supervisory role on financial flows. Bill Emmett actually concludes with more serious threat, and he said this. He said the West is often seen as being demoralized, decadent, deflating, demographically challenged, divided, disintegrating, dysfunctional, declining. This is really coming from someone, a former editor of The Economist, and I hope that leaders of the world, leaders of the West, will have to just look at it. Maybe the conclusion is a little bit harsh, but it has some, I would say, constructive warnings. And Bill Emmett actually suggests that we should foster more international rules, international collaboration, and all this sort of thing, which is, to my mind at the moment, is rather disintegrating. The third book, which is less threatening, but is a book by a Cambridge academic professor called Livesey. The book is called From Global to Local. From Global to Local, The Making of Things and the End of Globalization. You see the word end of globalization being repeated in speeches by leaders, former leaders of the world, by leading thought leaders. It's really happening, and we better realize it. We better be very right, instead of be, like Ken said, instead of precisely wrong. We should not be wrong by saying that this process of globalization into the third generation is something which is irrevocable, irreversible. It's not irreversible. Like I said, exogenous, but institution-wise, they can be reversible. Mr. Livesey was talking about the force of technology. Today, we are coming into a digital age, right? Digital age. Everybody is talking about AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, everything. And, in all of our economy, don't be worried about that. They said at least 40% of the work we are doing can be replaced easily by automation. So we better count on that. And more than that, because digitization process actually can have the consequence of reshoring, what they call reshoring, instead of offshoring, of reshoring, of taking back some of the things that used to be networked out of the country, back into the country. Because robots are cheaper than the cheapest labor force in Asia, for example, or in Africa or somewhere else. They can come back to the original richer countries by using robotics instead of doing that. The 3D, three-dimensional printing can afford us to do our own research design back at home instead of farming out everywhere. And the new form of medicine, what they call the biomedicine, treatment of cells and everything, should be done in-house more instead of farming out. So the modern technology force of digital age will not actually help to keep the network open, to have more international network of production and the globalization process that has emerged in the past. That would, like I said, institutional globalization, and this book, they call it technical deglobalization. There will be technical deglobalization. I have actually gone on for a bit longer than I thought, and maybe you're feeling that there's so many things that I've said that you might like to question me, because I still have some concluding remarks to make, but I have promised you to say something about Turkey, Venezuela, and all these things. I just try to conclude for you what I see. You see, the crisis in Turkey, again, everybody saw it coming. Yeah, right? Saw it coming. People normally now blame on the president, Mr. Erdogan, and if you are Turkish, you might blame it on Mr. Trump. Well, I would blame it on the policy-making exercise of Turkey. Turkey was very well advanced in their economic development policies, in their welfare provision for the people. So much so that the government has been spending so much money to subsidize wages, subsidize social protection, medical support, and everything. But at the time that they have not actually been successful in doing the thing that they should be doing that try to improve their productivity before they farm out the money, before they become very generous with their support to the people. Or that has to happen at the same time. But what happened is that they did all that in giving the welfare to the people without really earning their own income by borrowing so much. And as we've talked about, the interest rates are so low. The ease with which one can borrow in the international market in the last decade was really unprecedented. So it becomes so that Turkey has been losing their competitiveness all the time, while pumping in a lot of money has created inflation rate of around 15% per year. Their deficits on current accounts has been increasing so much so that their currency, their lira, this year I think, has dropped in value up to the level of 45%. That is alarming. Lira has lost value, nearly half of its value. It used to be 3 lira to $1 a few years ago in 2016. Now you go to Turkey, it's 7 lira to $2. It's now good for tourism in Turkey. But the thing is, in Turkey, they have accumulated international reserve, but only 100 billion. And they have an external debt of around 300, 400 billion. So it's beyond. If it's a corporation, then it's already illiquid. It's bankrupt. At the moment, I think they are not trying to get into the arms of the IMF. Nobody wants to get into the arms of the IMF. So they're trying to resist. But at the moment, the policymaker in Turkey also try not to allow interest rate to go up, because they have normal fear, as we all have, you see, because interest rates are too high and people suffer. So they have resisted interest rate to go up. But then when you do that, when you have deficit, then your currency value would come down, and that would even increase the level of inflation even more so. So if you don't cut the Gordian knot here, you will not be able to solve the issue. So at the moment, Turkey is in a bind. It will have to decide somewhere, somehow, to cut this Gordian knot. And it's difficult because I think the president has his son-in-law as a finance minister. So it's very difficult family business. But this should be a concern to Europe. I can tell you this. This should be a concern to Europe. Why? Because Europe has lent a lot of money to Turkey. I don't want to name banks here. I have them all here, but there are banks in Europe, good banks, less good banks. The banking system in Europe is another huge story altogether, you see. Europe has a union in everything except in banking business. You don't have banking union in Europe, and that is one of the flaws in Europe at the moment. So a few banks in Europe has huge exposure to Turkish debts. Some countries even close to $100 billion. Can you imagine? Turkey cannot be allowed to default. Turkey cannot be allowed to default. But let's not say never, never. I don't think Turkey should default. ECB, European Central Bank, should not allow Turkey to default. But of course, Turkey is not part of this, so I don't know how you do it, but at least there must be some lifeline coming from Europe to help Turkey, because not only is Turkey important in financial terms to Europe, Turkey has great geopolitical significance to Europe, because to the eastern side of Turkey is a kind of expansionist country that is pushing at that border. So Europe needs protection from that side. Turkey, at the moment, has done a lot of, a charitable thing for Europe, because it has accepted more than 3 million Syrian refugees, kept them in Turkey. And they're all waiting to join the European Union. This is alarming news, but at least they're doing great service to Europe. More than that, what is it? The defense system. I think the missile defense system somewhere. Turkey was supposed to be doing that, buying that from the West, United States. Now they decided to buy it from the East, from Russia. And many things are happening there that would give Europe, I don't know, because I don't feel that people in Europe are having sleepless nights in Turkey, but I think leaders should have, because it's something that you cannot say never. It could happen, and of course, if it doesn't happen, a default is just cannot be allowed. Cannot be allowed. Okay, the implication more than Europe for the rest of the world is that because of the bad news coming out of Turkey, it has the ripple effects on the rest of the globalizing emerging economies. You see, the impact on Argentina, on Indonesia, on Pakistan, on Venezuela has been really devastating. Has been devastating because, well, you see, they are grouped under the same category of the emerging economies. Like I said from the beginning, emerging economy used to be the strength of the new growth after the Great Recession, but now collapse of Turkish lira has actually now implied collapse of the peso in Argentina, in Venezuela. Already, I think they've gone into default already in Venezuela. So, in Venezuela, the IMF has predicted that, in case you may need to go to Caracas these days, predicted that Venezuela will hit 1,000,000% of inflation by the end of the year. 1,000,000%. And it means that when you go to buy a piece of bread, you would have to have a wheelbarrow to carry all your banknotes to go and buy small amenities. And this is a country, Venezuela is one of the richest countries in terms of raw material. It has the largest oil reserve in the world. I used to go there. People, rich or poor, they own a little car because gasoline is just next to nothing. It's just cheaper than going into a bus. Just buy gasoline, just a few dollars, and fill the tank. So, social protection, again, perfect, except for the thing that they are not competitive. They can't sell goods to the world. They over-subsidize, and they print money to subsidize. So they have huge. This is the kind of inflation that we've never seen before since the Second World War. Used to be one of the richest countries in Latin America. But now they have just cut 5 zeros from their banknotes the other day, cut 5 zeros from their banknotes, because otherwise people cannot actually carry thousands of banknotes to buy their amenities anymore. What is very interesting to watch is that they have pegged the new bolivars, their currency, the new bolivars, to something what they call cryptocurrency. This is a very fashionable thing, because nobody knows what is cryptocurrency, because it doesn't exist in papers, it doesn't exist in coin. It's just in the air, because you have the air, you have the wave, you have the cryptocurrency. So they pegged the new bolivar to cryptocurrency that still has not been circulating and not known where it's coming from, the value of which. Anyway, so this is another sad story coming up, and again, don't underestimate the kind of debt burden on the emerging markets, which will be aggravating and spilling over from one economy to another. Argentina, you remember Argentina? I used to visit with President Nesto, some years ago, President who came in after the IMF rescue operation of 2001. I was at the WTO. Yes, Kirchner, Nestor Kirchner. Yes, thank you, Nestor. I had long conversation with him, and he asked me, because I came from Thailand, we experienced our own, how would I say, mishap with the fund, the way the fund tried to rescue us but make things even worse. And then Nestor Kirchner came, and I had a long discussion with him how to avoid. And in 2001, there was a big collapse, and that was after the rescue operation of the IMF. Now, at the moment, they are negotiating again because of the turbulence spreading over from Turkey and other emerging economies. They are renegotiating with the IMF again. But it's not going to be successful easily, because the kind of austerity that the fund would need to have for a country like this will not be tolerated by the public, because people are already in grave poverty. And government debt is just nearly 100% of that GDP, which is really very, very grave, because normally, the normal criterion is that you should not have government debt exceeding 60% of the GDP. Argentina is going to 100% and even beyond that. So if not safe, it will go into default, and that is, again, another sad story here. And that can spread to other countries in Latin America. The other day, my friend from ASEAN told me that Indonesia rupee back in 1997, 1998, together with Thailand and other countries in Asia, we went into the financial crisis. Indonesian rupee was at the lowest point in those days, 20 years ago. Just last month, again, the rupee dropped to the level that we haven't seen before since the summer of 1998 again. So it's again to the level that actually preceded the crisis in Asia. This again should not be underestimated, but Indonesia is still fortunate. They have very capable finance minister, which I completely trust, and she's doing her best, I think, to try to shore up that. And interest rates are creeping up. They have to suffer. They have to have austerity measures. They have to suffer a bit, but at least they have been a little bit unfortunate, unlike Thailand, because you see, sometimes you can be so much attractive that your attractiveness can become a poisonous gift. Because Indonesian government bonds, during the boom period in the last couple of years in Indonesia, used to be very popular with foreign investors. Government bonds have been actually gobbled up by foreign investors. Investment of foreign investors in Indonesia bond is probably more than 40% of the total bond holding. Now, at the moment that they're losing confidence, they're selling everything. In Thailand, the holding of bonds, because I don't know whether we've not been popular or not popular, but at least we're just in the middle. So government bonds are being held by outsiders, foreigners, about up to the level of 10% of the total market of the bond. So when they sell bonds in Thailand, nothing happened. But in Indonesia, when foreign investors begin to offload the government bonds, it hits the national currency very strongly. These are a few of the things that are just blips, you see, on the warning signals that I see happening, but I think people will be seeing, but people sometimes tend to overlook or forget or try to sweep it under the carpet, because ugly thing people will never like to see. Let me end. I come back to the U.S. The other day, 2 months ago in August, as every year, as like Davos, I quote Mr. Xi Jinping, I like to draw your attention to the so-called Jackson Hole meeting. You know, Jackson Hole meeting is an annual meeting of the central bankers around the world. Jackson Hole is a place where you go as a respectable central bankers. to talk about the problem of the world. And at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, they try to resolve the problems of the world, which they've been doing that every year. They've been doing that every year. Now, this year, at Jackson Hole, people have been asking Mr. Jerome Powell, Jay Powell, what do you think, Mr. Chairman? Because this year, the US government is supposed to be raising interest rates 2 more times. They've done already once or twice already. Twice. 4 times they should raise interest rates. Now, Mr. Powell was asked this, and he was very cautious. He's the first non-economist Fed chairman. Something very strange this day. Non-economist winning economics Nobel Prize. Non-economist being appointed to the chairmanship position of Federal Reserve. So anyway, it could be improvement. He was saying something which is very interesting. He was saying that at the moment, the path of Fed's policy begins to look fraught with complications. No more straightforward quantitative tightening. There used to be quantitative easing, right? After quantitative easing, after QE, it is now the process of quantitative tightening. And he quotes, because of messy US politics and some of the plausible political drama makes it harder for Fed to raise interest rates. He said, and this one I quote, there were risk factors that could demand a different policy response. So you know, there might be interest rate. I'm for one. If I would have been part of the Board of Governors of the Fed, I would resist certainly for the interest rate to go up in the United States today, because the figures on employment, on growth has been, again, uneven. And the kind of trade policies that has been presented by this US government is still being fraught with doubts around the world. I wouldn't call it trade war or protectionism, because in past US governments, administrations, similar policies have been brought forward anyway. People tend to blame Mr. Trump for being more protectionist than others. My experience, I've seen with the WTO, Mr. Bush used to do the steel thing as well. Mr. Obama used to say about things not making America great, but saying buy us, buy America, which is against the spirit of the World Trade Organization. So let's not say that this is a new thing, that Mr. Trumponomics that would create problems trade war. I don't think so. It's a way of the President of the United States trying to leverage his position, trying to gain certain vantage position against those that he have to negotiate with. And he will be probably successful now in trying to regenerate, re-engineer NAFTA. So NAFTA 2.0 is now being completed as we're seeing, and this is actually what Mr. Trump has been promising, and people would say in the beginning that it would not be possible, but now he's doing it. But because of the uncertainty of the threats, the perceived uncertainty, because the threats have not yet been executed, only sometime partly. So, I mean, the Fed chair is saying this. This is one thing that he said. The second thing, what happened in Jackson Hole this year in August, also quite interesting, because normally central bank would deal only with monetary issues. But this is the first time that they deal with the non-monetary issues, which is the issue of why the labor share of total national income has been declining from year to year. This is something that I have mentioned to you from the beginning. This is part of the result consequences from the excessive liquidity injection into the market that has not gone into the real production, not gone into productivity increase, but has gone into the excessive appreciation of the asset value. So asset price gone up, people who are richer, owning wealth, assets, they're gaining in terms of their income. Those who are income earners, have they not seen their income increasing at all. So this is a big issue with the Fed, because Why this is a big issue? Because if the Fed keep on raising their own policy rates, they would hit the poor even more. Now, the tax reform that has been agreed on by the Trump administration and is being implemented today, economists tend to agree that it would have even more the impact of aggravating the income gap, because the exemption, tax exemption for the rich is going to be much larger than for the poor. Why? To finance the exemption of the tax for the rich, they have cut down on the kind of the care programs for the elderly and and those who are unemployed. So the social entitlement programs have been cut down to finance the tax reduction for the rich. So this is again a world turned upside down, I've said, and it's a world that we should have a global governance. Some institution that would be able to take everything that I said today and not to be concerned, but to put them all together and invite the world to try to sort out the issues. You would have said to me then as a response, oh, well, we have G20, G8, G7. You know what they do? I mean, G7, in my own experience, I've been working with them at the time that I was with the WTO and UNCTAD. It's quite a long period of time, more than 5, 6, 7 years. Every year, I went to talk to them because the Doha Development Agenda, you remember, this is the new trade round that people have already forgotten. This is the longest ever trade round that has been negotiated ever. It started in 2001. This is 2018. It's been 17 years. Uruguay round, the round before this Doha agenda, lasted only 7 or 8 years. 8 years. It's been 17 years and there is no end to it. So this is going to be an unfinished symphony, unfinished round. Every year I went to talk to G7, used to be G8 with Russia. Every year the G7, G8 issue a grand statement. This year, we're going to task our trade negotiators, our commerce ministers to go and finish the round next month, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, every year like this. After the first year, second year, third year, I kept warning, please, you are losing respect from the rest of the world, because how can the leaders of the world sit together every year and cannot even request their own trade ministers to agree on something which is so simple? You agree with things more than that among bilateral, regional agreement, but at the multilateral you cannot agree. Every year it's become something which is embarrassing to the world. So at the moment we don't have a functional global governance that could take care of the ills of the world. G7 doesn't function that way. This, I don't know how many times, now they stop issuing this statement. They don't say that we should end the Doha round anymore. They don't say it anymore. They don't say it. They just keep saying we are trying to convince each other not to increase the level of trade restriction. And look, oh and behold, everybody goes back home, they raise their own trade protection restriction. Everyone, every country. G20, the same thing. You look at agenda of G20 and you have thought this is the agenda of the IMF, because it's the IMF that has been actually the secretariat to the G20 meetings. We try to compete. When I was at the UNCTAD, at the UN, we used to tell them that, look, I mean, G20 was the idea conceived by the UN, you see. We conceived of G20 because the ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Commission at the UN, did not function properly because the big nations, the big donors, they don't care about ECOSOC. They said, if you come to ECOSOC, we have to listen to the poor countries complaining this and that, so we don't come. So we in 2007, we said we should do something which is effective. So we proposed the idea of G20, and then President Bush at that time, he told us, I'm leaving the office, let me chair the first meeting, let the US be the chair. So he took it away and he hijacked it, and so G20 become something that is now outside of the UN entity, which is unfortunate. Because the UN has 190-something countries, 93 countries. G20 is G20. So where is the 173 countries? They're not there to voice their complaints. So again, we don't have a global governance, and this is something that is very much in need at the moment. If you want to tackle all the issues, not to allow crisis to be another, just statistics happen times and again, and the level of poverty increasing. We're not going to meet our Agenda 2030, the so-called Sustainable Development Agenda, which is something which is meant to overturn the mistakes coming out of the capitalist market economy. Meant to do that. The 17 goals there, which we have agreed a few years ago, 2015, 2030 is a goal of eradication of poverty, gender equality, ecological improvement, renewable energy, how many percentage points increase. So this is the thing. So we must be able to do that. And I have been making some suggestions sometime in the past that if we cannot reform ECOSOC at the moment, the ultimate thing is what we should do is to try to reform the ECOSOC, to make the economic and social committee of the UN work to the benefit of the 193 odd countries membership of the UN. Then we should revamp the G7. We should revamp the G7. And Mr. Trump the other day was trying to re-invite back the Russian. You remember the Quebec, I don't want to quote, I have a lot of quotes coming from Quebec meeting, and there was horrible quotes there. Just maybe for your interest. One small quote. Die Welt, the largest German newspaper, they wrote a long article on the G summit in Quebec and called the summit, quote unquote, the end of the West. The end of the West. Which is sad, because if this happened really, which is probably exaggerated by Die Welt, then it means a very traumatic thing for the whole world. So what I try to suggest is that instead of doing something, if ECOSOC doesn't work, then maybe we should try to reinvent the Quad, the G4, as a precursor to the ECOSOC reform. And G4 should include US, EU, Japan, and China. How can the second largest economy in the world, and to be the largest economy in the world in the next couple of years, next 5 years, and the largest exporter trading nation of the world, not be included in the global governance, in the G4 in the Quads? So I'm suggesting that the US, China, EU, and Japan should be replacing the old Quads. The old Quads have been gone, dysfunctional long ago. That used to be US, Canada, EU, Japan. But to replace it with US, China, EU, Japan. And then you can talk about the way that we can, if the West or the US is so much in concern of what is happening in China, then China should be taken on board so that China could become a member, a mature member of the global community and can be together sitting on the same table negotiating for a new global rule-making exercise.